Hey, what's going on, guys? Just got out of the field doing an ASMR backcountry trip for YouTube for Fieldcraft Survival. Mike Force just dropped as soon as I got out of the field. Really excited about it because it's with a good friend of mine, Pat Watkins, who is a retired Master Sergeant, who at the time of his service was awarded a Distinguished Service Cross for actions that took place August of 1968, but wasn't awarded that Distinguished Service Cross until 2014 because of the nature of the job, being a MAC-V operator, a Green Beret in Vietnam, working with the Central Intelligence Agency doing cross-border operations overseas. So I am going to do him a service by reading his honorable narrative citation, which accompanies the award that you submit, because I want you guys to know the details of the exact events that he did, because I want to get his award, the Distinguished Service Cross, upgraded to the Medal of Honor. I am not somebody who's really closely tied to politics for a specific reason. I don't like politicians. I have several friends that are politicians that are good ones. But if you have any contacts with anybody who needs to hear this citation and how and why this is not a Medal of Honor citation is beyond me. More likely politics than anything else. But I thought I would read this out loud and also let you know that the story, the podcast that I did with him about the story, including the citation, which is from a story that happened to him in 1968 in FOB 4, as well as his story through his service as a MAC-V SOG. 27 months, Green Beret, he spent in Vietnam. 27 months of combat, guys. Also, I apologize. I try to upload this on channels and on IG, but IG sucks really bad. So here we go. This is the narrative to accompany citation for Distinguished Service Cross to Staff Sergeant Patrick Watkins. I'll call him Pat, so I don't have to say Staff Sergeant again and again. But Pat, U.S. Army Special Forces, was assigned as a recon patrol leader with the Command and Control Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Republic of Vietnam. Distinguished himself on the evening of morning 22 through 23 August 1968 while waiting to attend a promotion board ceremony. Yeah, I talked to him on the podcast, and he said they pulled him into this FOB, which is a headquarters forward operating base, because they wanted to give him a promotion board where they literally grill you as a staff sergeant so you can get promoted to sergeant first class in the middle of combat. Whatever. It's funny because in Afghanistan, I did my promotion board for sergeant first class as well, or for, it was actually, was it my staff sergeant? I can't remember. It was a promotion board, but nonetheless, it was a promotion board in combat, and everybody was like, what are we doing here? I must have been a staff sergeant. But they do that in combat, and it happens to be a little less formal, except he had to get his uniform together. And he told them he didn't have a uniform. Funny story, that's on the podcast. Anyways, the compound in which Staff Sergeant Watkins, Pat, and a large group of American team members came under attack from a large determined force of North Vietnamese sappers. If you don't know what sappers are, they're the guys who are trained specifically at sabotage, subversion through breaching, mainly explosive breaching. The apparent assistance was from the agents inside the CCN compound. They were able to breach the security of the compound and proceeded to assault the buildings in which the men were sleeping. This happened about 2 a.m. Pat, having heard the initial explosions, signaled the start of the attack, recognized that the explosions were not from incoming fire, but from within the camp, and immediately began to respond. Although the only weapon he had at the time was a .45 caliber pistol, a Colt. That Colt pistol was issued to him, and that's not typical, but it happens in an FOB. When you come from a fire base, you might have to leave behind your weapon system in an armory, and then they'll let you keep your sidearm or a smaller pistol. I don't know why you would ever do that, but I even had to do it at certain fire bases or certain FOBs that I visited in combat, so it's not unusual. One of his roommates for the evening, a lieutenant, brand new lieutenant, went to the window to see what was going on and was immediately shot. Pat said he was actually shot in the shoulder while looking outside the building. As Pat was checking on the wounded, the ceiling on Pat and the wounded lieutenant fell on them after an explosion, and Staff Sergeant Joseph Conlon began applying a field dressing on the lieutenant's arm. Pat jumped on Staff Sergeant Cologne to shield him from the debris and assisted in digging them out from underneath it, believing that their building would be next to be attacked. Staff Sergeant Watkins, Pat, directed Staff Sergeant Cologne to take his Car 15 to the south side of the building to cover the part of the building while he went to the north side with his .45 caliber pistol. So it's a big building. Pat went to one door, Joe went to another door. As Pat reached the door, an enemy sapper appeared in the doorway preparing to throw a satchel charge in the building. Pat actually said he lit it, and he saw him light it. Staff Sergeant Watkins shot him, but not before the enemy sapper had a chance to roll a grenade into the room. Pat reacted by covering his head and yelling, as per SOP, "Grenade." The explosion peppered him with shrapnel, and the force of the detonation caused him to be thrown back in the middle of the room. Recovering from the effects of the blast, he then looked for the sapper he had shot and saw at the end of the room where the sapper had been standing was covered in blood, and the sapper was outside the building, some 20 feet away, dead from a head wound. Pat noticed that the intense automatic fire was coming from the new Tactical Operations Center. Both he and Staff Sergeant Joe Conlon, though wounded, made their way to the building next door that had been destroyed in the large blast. As they did so, found 2 wounded Americans in the debris of the building. Pat directed that Joe escort these 2 wounded men to the dispensary because of the seriousness of their wounds. As Staff Sergeant Watkins continued to search for more wounded men, he heard a cry for help from a seriously wounded man some 40 meters away near the latrines. As Pat crawled towards the cries for help, another sapper appeared, and Pat immediately shot him with his pistol. The wounded man by the latrines screamed, warning to Staff Sergeant Watkins that there was a sniper nearby who was using him as bait, and Staff Sergeant Watkins not to come to his aid. Obviously, Pat disregarded this. Pat nonetheless continued to crawl towards the latrines and the wounded man. On the way, he recognized the voice of one of the wounded men to be his good friend and head medic, Sergeant First Class Robert Scully. He determinedly continued to crawl over to him. Once there, he immediately saw that Sergeant First Class Scully had a grievous open head wound. In the podcast on Mike Force, I'll link down below, he said that he saw gray matter. He saw his brain. A grenade was thrown by the sniper towards Staff Sergeant Watkins and Scully, so Staff Sergeant Watkins threw his body over Scully in an attempt to shield him from the blast and the shrapnel. Both he and Scully suffered fragmentation wounds on their legs from the resulting explosion. As Staff Sergeant Watkins looked up, he spotted the sapper who had thrown the grenade kneeling down beside the camp generator. So, in Staff Sergeant Watkins fashion, he shot him 4 times with his pistol. He then carried and dragged the wounded Scully to a more protected area where he was once again joined by Staff Sergeant Conlon and a new man, Sergeant First Class Roscoe Henderson. Watkins and these 2 other men loaded the grievously wounded Scully on a makeshift litter to get him to the dispensary. As they made their way, 2 sappers came around the building and started shooting. Both Pat and Conlon returned fire, hitting one of the sappers and causing the sappers to retreat. Now they began to achieve additional fire from atop Marble Mountain, the large limestone karst that overlooked the camp. Despite this, increasingly incoming automatic fire and mortar fire, the small group led by Pat finally made it to a medical jeep that was looking for wounded to transport to the dispensary. Pat then loaded wounded Scully on the back of the jeep for the trip to the dispensary, and the 3 men now went back to continue to search for other wounded teammates. As they approached the wrecked barracks, an American voice sapper stood up from the wreckage and began firing in the direction of the group, led by Staff Sergeant Watkins. Staff Sergeant Watkins returned fire with his pistol, all the while assaulting towards the enemy sniper and shooting the NVA at least 3 times with his .45 automatic until it was empty. Pat relieved the dead NVA of his AK-47 and finally had some firepower to defend himself and his men. The small group of men, being led by Pat, now made its way towards the bachelor's officer's quarters, where they found Lieutenant Colonel Smith and his sergeant major from the FOB. These men also had some wounded and were trying to get to a safer area. Whereupon, Pat directed them to get to the latrine, reasoning it would be easier to secure and defend. As a small but growing group of men made their way to the latrine, Pat advised Lieutenant Colonel Smith that he was going to continue to search for wounded, despite his own wounds. Throughout the hours of the early morning, Pat continued, along with Sergeant First Class Henderson and Joe Cologne, to search for survivors and direct them to the relative safety of the latrine, where they could get some medical assistance. During all of this time, Pat continuously exposed himself to unrelenting fire from snipers on Marble Mountain and the sappers who were now attempting to clear out the wrecked CCN headquarters compound. As dawn broke over the South China Sea, the intensity of the sapper attack waned, although sappers continued to be discovered and killed within the compound. As the compound slowly began to reorganize, the men of CCN began to clear the area of the remaining sappers and began to clear the beach, finally ending the threat. Pat Watkins was wounded several times, yet despite these wounds, continued his dogged and determined mission to rescue as many of his operator buddies as he could. I added that. It's very much more formal than I read it. In the finest traditions of the United States Army Special Forces and the U.S. Army Green Berets. 16 Americans were killed that night. 16 Americans. Personally, Pat, from what I read and from what I heard of his story, killed 4 enemy combatants themselves and was involved in many other engagements that night. He also personally saved the lives of many, including his buddy, Sergeant First Class Scully, who was the medic, who survived despite his wounds, even the open head wound that he had. Now, one of the disappointing things is the politics that get involved in men like Pat Watkins and his band of merry heroes from MACV-SOG. The reason this is because of all the politics that were involved. I mean, we see this happening now. All the politics and the diplomacy and the military actions that are taking place. The last people getting taken care of are the men who are on the ground. So let me read you finally Staff Sergeant Watkins' U.S. Army Distinguished Award, the Distinguished Service Cross. How they read it, everybody stands at the position of attention. You should do that as well. But typically how it's ran is attention to orders, and then it's read. For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations involving conflict with an armed enemy in the Republic of Vietnam while serving with Headquarters and Headquarters Company Command and Control North, CNC was MACV-SOG in 1968. 5th Special Forces Group, 1st Special Forces, Staff Sergeant Watkins distinguished himself by exponentially, words are hard, exceptionally, that's a misspelling, valorous actions in the early morning hours of 23 August 1968, while at Headquarters, Command and Control North when the compound was attacked by a North Vietnamese Army sapper force in a well-coordinated assault. Despite being wounded in the initial assault, Staff Sergeant Watkins quickly organized a small QRF to repel the attack and rescue wounded Americans while leading them to a defensive position through a gauntlet of machine gun fire and grenades. Staff Sergeant Watkins disregarded his own safety to direct the recovery of the many wounded men and repeatedly engaged and killed enemy sappers. Despite receiving several more wounds from grenade shrapnel, Staff Sergeant Watkins repeatedly repelled numerous sappers as he continued to search for the wounded. He refused medical aid and on one occasion fiercely charged an onrushing NVA sniper, killing him and preventing the sniper's continuing infliction of numerous friendly casualties. His actions inspired his men to greater heights to defeat the enemy and successfully defend the compound. Staff Sergeant Watkins' extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. If that is not a Medal of Honor citation, I don't know what is. And this should be upgraded. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to fight in the state of Utah, because he is a local Utahn, to have this upgraded. He's 83 years old. This is unheard of. I mean, this happens all the time. But in the case of this specific action, what's unheard of is that this award was awarded when he was alive. Most awards, including Medal of Honors, were awarded posthumously because the brave men of MACV-SOG were killed a lot, wounded a lot. In fact, they have the highest attrition of both being wounded and being killed and being missing in combat than any other organization in the U.S. Army. I think in history. I'm pretty sure in history of United States warfare. So I think it's something that we should repeat, pass along. If you want to, pass this along to anybody you know that in the political landscape or people who care. What I'll likely be doing is doing a campaign, hopefully getting signatures for people so I could get a little bit of attention put on this. I have a meeting next week with the mayor of my town. Also, I've put in 4 meetings with the senator in my district, as well as the Congress representative in my district as well. Guys, I appreciate you. I appreciate you watching the podcast and respecting men like Staff Sergeant Pat Watkins and all the men he served with, those brave men and women that did a lot of the work in our past that I'm so thankful for, because if it wasn't for them, if it wasn't for their sacrifice, we wouldn't have the opportunities we have today. Thanks, guys.